everyone. Welcome to Chuck's Train Talk Media podcast. Tonight, Dave Vollmer and I, Ed Kapuscinski, have taken over for Chuck. Dave and I are just going to talk about the pursuit of realism for a while.
So it says, for listeners who may be new to you, how would you each describe your approach to model railroading in one sentence? Well, if I had to say one sentence, I guess I like trains.
I distill it down to make it look real, make it operate like it's real, and have fun.
I think a lot of the folks probably have seen my stuff either in, Model Railroader or, N-Scale magazine or whatever. But for me, realism, I love the idea of recreating something that people have either seen or imagined that they could have seen at one time in history, just in miniature.
Right. Like, I think that's a huge thing that modelers are pursuing. Either that there are things that they wish they could have seen. When you think about, I don't think I had a chance to expound upon this on my previous episode with Chuck, but the idea of third wave enthusiasts about a railroad, people who've never actually experienced it in person, that realistic model railroads are a way recreate and experience a thing that you've never seen. Right. I mean, it's kind of why I enjoy playing with late 70s Conrail stuff. And it's definitely why I enjoy playing with the turn of the century O-scale stuff that I've done.
Well, that's been pretty much every one of my modeling endeavors, whether it's the Pensy, which died 6 years before I was born, whether it's the Colorado Midland that I was born, 80 years too late for, or the Rio Grande Southern, which is my major pursuit in HON3, which, of course, was abandoned. It was torn up in 1952-53. And, of course, I was born after that.
Yeah, but I think there's a really interesting parallel between you and I when it comes to your modeling of the RGS and my modeling of the Northern Central, that there are still remnants of it around, right? That you've hiked the right of way. You can drive along and see where things were. There are preserved elements of it, of course. The Northern Central's the same way. Part of it's still got Norfolk Southern on it. Part of it's got the Northern Central Railway, formerly steam into history. But a lot of it's a trail. Right? Which is fun in its own right. Had a chance a couple of years ago to walk parts of it and take photos of it. And I took one of those photos, found a Conrail photo, cut out the equipment from it, and put it in the photo. And it's not my best Photoshop effort because I did it pretty quickly, but it is pretty entertaining. In two-dimensional form, I did what I'm trying to do in three-dimensional form in the basement.
And when it comes to modeling something realistically, I'm lucky in that, I've chosen a prototype that was only 162 miles long, but is ridiculously well documented, considering that it only lasted about 62 years. And as an extensive fan base, a lot of the records were saved. They exist up at the Colorado Railroad Museum. I say up at. And a lot of the rolling stock and structures, and like you said, the right-of-way, a lot of that is pretty well preserved, in a large part because a lot of it's very remote, which is good and bad, hard to get to, but also means that, there won't be building subdivisions on the RGS right away. Well, they kind of have in Telluride, but, whereas, a lot of the East Coast railroads that I'm also a fan of, once those tracks are gone, that's prime real estate.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. It's wild to see so many things that are just completely gone. It's funny, right before this recording, I was looking at some photos that someone had sent me of the Ma and Pa, which the right of way was right across the street from my house. When I hang a left at my driveway and drive a little bit out to the park where I take my dog and everything, even though it is still pretty suburban out there. And it's just wild seeing, here's a photo of this trestle that explains why this one road that if you make a right up it, the narrow or the lanes are really narrow, and it's out because there was a trestle here that you had to go through. And the trestle was built for a horse and buggy, not a Cadillac Escalade.
Well, you can find roads like that under the middle division on the Pensy too. Like, I'm trying to think out near in the vicinity of Spruce Creek. There's like one. I just remember driving under it, and I think we had a car top carrier on. And I'm like, I don't know, we're going to make it. And we just barely did.
Although out there, you still may get horse and buggies.
Well, that's very true.
It's a lot of it sounds like if you're modeling to recreate history, either in a real or an imagined form, that realism and trying to strive for realism is a really important part of that, right? Or a huge component of it, because it's one thing to say, hey, here's my model railroad that I'm trying to recreate the the Pennsy Middle Division in the 1940s on a door, and then your door layout is, a figure eight with 3 tunnels, 2 spindly wooden trestles, and the only thing that bears resemblance to Pennsy is the fact that you've got a couple of Tycho sea liners with keystones on them running around, versus the way that you did that, which was to take the essence of the Middle Division and scale it down with a very sharp eye and a very sharp wit. And don't get too full of yourself here. But, in a way that I think a lot of people have recognized that, like, when people see your Juniata division, even though there's only 2 tracks and the real one had 4, people are like, yeah, no, that's the Pennsy, right? And I think that's a critical part of doing that.
So you might remember, I did an invited talk at the N-Scale Enthusiast Convention when it was in Harrisburg. I think it was 2011, sometime frame like that. And it was getting the most from a small model railroad. But part of that was, okay, and this actually goes to one of Chuck's questions here on what separates realistic modeling from simply detailed modeling, right? And it's making informed decisions about what to keep and what to not include, right? And so, a lot of what I ended up talking about wasn't just, hey, how do you cram a whole bunch of stuff into a hollow core door, but, how do you select elements that tell the story?
Mm-hmm.
And with Pennsy, of course, we all think, heavy duty mainline railroading. Now, Pennsy had some really weedy, broken down branches too, but we think about, the Middle Division and the America's Broadway of commerce. And what are some things that establish that? Well, a very well manicured ballast line. You have position light signals. You have very Pennsy style signage like whistle posts and so on. You have Pennsy standard tool houses and sheds and depots and all of this stuff. And even in a small space, you can do that. So that's, to me, is the realistic part. It doesn't matter how much I detail those things, as long as the general elements and the lines are there and it looks, because I challenge you, when you look at a picture in a railroad book, if you're just kind of skimming through the book, you're not going to see all the detail there. Now, maybe you're going to try to model that scene and then you're studying it like you might study for an exam. But most of the time, you just see some elements that pop out and go, oh, that's clearly Pennsy because it's got a keystone sign on the depot. There's a position light signal there. Done, right?
Mm-hmm. I think there's another aspect to that too, which are the things that you see that you don't see, right? And that's one of the Pennsy elements that I think your JD did a really good job of capturing. The visible things, like the highly obvious things. Buildings are the right color. You've got position lights. You're using stone arch bridges, right? You also got a lot of the other things right too, which was that when the Pennsy encountered the environment, the Pennsy conquered the environment. That it didn't say, oh, hey, well, there's this, this big gully here. I guess you better go. Like, they didn't build Horseshoe Curve because they couldn't get across that valley, right? They built Horseshoe Curve because they needed to get across the valley and go uphill. So instead of just building up the creek and then building down the other side of the creek, they built up the one side of the creek. And then they built a fill that was, bigger than any fill on like the Mampah.
And they also removed the face of Kittatinning Mountain to do it.
Exactly. And then they're like, oh, well, this is a good idea, but, well, let's put a little branch line up here. And we'll put a branch line up there. And let's put a giant coaling station in place. And, oh, you know what? We should build a reservoir for the city we're building down in the bottom of this, right? And that complete disregard for the natural environment was kind of a hallmark of the early Pennsy. And I think your layout did a good job of capturing that, the way that even though you had a kind of model railroady thing where you had a bridge and then a tunnel real close to it, you still did the right thing that the Pennsy would have done there, where there was the bridge, but there was a fill coming up to the bridge, the rock cut before the tunnel, properly Pennsy in that regard. Not just the you didn't just get the buildings right. You didn't just get the right signals, but you also got those, more subtle, but equally essence of what that railroad is.
So it's my turn to praise your work, because I was thinking about this. You were talking about the things that you see, but you don't see, but you would notice if they weren't there. Mm-hmm. And this is where your work, I definitely need to kind of pay more attention to what you're doing with whatever my next project is. The way you model the right of way, I remember you did that experimental piece where you actually took the Pensies, like their ballast profile and the ditches along the sides. You have culverts where they belong, where they would make sense to be. Railroad engineering is a big part of what I think makes a realistic model realistic, right? You've probably heard me talk about bridge engineering. I see people build bridges that would never be physically possible. Pennsy was known for over engineering, but even like my Colorado Narrowgate stuff, those trestles have to support, they have to support trains that don't weigh a little, right? And they have to do it and stand up to high winds and heavy snows and so on. So the right-of-way modeling that you do that includes all those little details that most people don't even bother to model. Just so when you show those pictures of yours with especially at that S-curve, and everything about that right away looks like it's properly engineered. Not even just necessarily by Pennsy, by any respecting class one, just nails it. And I really am attracted to that kind of modeling because that means that the person has taken the time to understand the engineering and the geology behind what they're planning, what they're choosing to model. And that is a next level of modeling that I highly respect.
Thank you. And I put a lot of effort into that. First, I want to, of course, give credit where that's due. Right? I wish I had come up with that realization of, hey, engineer your layout. Like, the prototype engineers, they're right away. But a lot of that mindset came from, God, I can remember where I was when I read it. I was in a Darton NTRAC meeting back in like the late 90s. Someone had, I guess it was a copy of MR, and I'm reading through it. And there was an article in there that was written by, unsurprisingly, Tony Custer, about getting the ballast profile right for the project he was working on at the time. And I think he was gearing up to start doing his prototype-focused nickel plate stuff. And he started off by doing a tracing the nickel plate's standard ballast profile on a card that he then cut out and turned into a template. And then he went another step further, because he's Tony, and made a hot wire cutter form for that. So what he was able to do when he was building his layout on a piece of extruded styrofoam was he literally took the hot wire cutter, put the center line of his cutter in the middle of the track, and just started going. And it did the whole ballast profile for him, which was really great because then he could come in and shape the terrain around it, but it gave him the very realistic starting point, which was properly scaled, which I think is a huge part of realism and trying to capture realism. But it also made the whole thing possible and easy to do. So you're not sitting there with you're not sitting there doing it the way that I tend to do it with a utility knife, making sure you carve out that profile right, and then realizing, I got that too far, or I have to come back and do it again, and then fill in the gaps with lightweight spackle. Now, with Tony, there's a reason why Tony is who he is, and it's because he does things the easy way to do this is you just make the pattern and you cut it out, right? But the interesting thing that I found when I did that myself, that study piece you were talking about, I based it off of Conrail's standards for new construction. And I'm like, this looks really good, except for the fact that I'm modeling a stretch of railroad that was built in the 1850s. And I realized that all sorts of things on that don't translate to historic stuff like that. That was really a formative thing in my mind of, you know what? You can't just trust reference material, or you can't trust generalized reference material. You have to go, do your own research. In doing that, I lucked out. Again, the Northern Central is almost all of it is a trail of some fashion. And going and walking, and you can see, hey, look, in some places, the Pennsy really did the Pennsy thing where they built this up on a fill and it looks great. In other places, it's just it looks, it looks like the RGS almost. Capturing that mix is one of the things that I think really helps to making that scene that you were talking about come together the way it does. Because, I've been there. I know, in parts of the Northern Central, it's a bit of a gentle slope down to the creek bed. In other places, it's just boom.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because there's such a dichotomy between. So I have the Pensy plan books, the standard plans of the standard railroad of the world, that have the profiles for heavy mainline Pensy stuff, say in the 19-teens, 20s timeframe. And then having gone out and walked the right of way of the RGS and learning about their bridge and building department was basically ballast will be local materials, which is generally cinders and mud. And you walk that right away and you realize that there's still some engineering to it. There are some on the sides. There are some fills, obviously, leading up to trestles and so on. But places where, these mountains move, where, even the best laid plans, where, just a little 3-foot railroad without a fraction of the resources that the Pensy had is just at the mercy of nature in this unforgiving climate. And that's different. So going from modeling heavy Pensy mainline railroading to a backwoods narrow gauge railroad that never paid a dividend on its stock in its entire career was a very different way. It was a great challenge, though, because to me, I guess, in kind of wrapping this back into the realism discussion, and before we jump into section 3, was, for me, I wanted to challenge myself to be able to do different things. And I've always had interests in lots of different railroads. I think we all do. And I've always had an interest in the Colorado narrow gauge, as well as like mainline Pensy stuff, and wanted to see if I could do it. And it's a very different set of challenges. It's how do you model track that looks decrepit, but you still want trains to actually operate on it, right? There's some challenges there, but I think we've started dipping into the questions about what scenery mistakes do we see some other modelers make. And before I jump into that, everybody's out here to have fun. It's a big tent, big hobby, and not everybody wants to go for ultra realism. And there's a whole segment that is into fantasy modeling, and that's great. I think for me, though, I look for, when somebody is pursuing realism, and how I help to guide them there, is kind of the advice you gave me. And I'm just going to throw it back to you, which is the observe the real world and don't spend as much time observing what other people have modeled. Mm-hmm. Great mistake that I see a lot of times. People's roads are too narrow. What's great is you can do the research online. The manual for uniform traffic control devices for each year that was published, you can find out what lane widths are and what the road marking should be for the era that you're in, and so on. I see roads are ridiculously small. Like that looks like an alleyway in Ireland, and that's supposed to be like U.S. Route 22 through Pennsylvania. No.
Yeah. And I mean, there are many horrors to living in the modern world. But one of the wonderful things is the fact that we have at our hand, or at our fingertips, Google Maps. Yep. Like just the other day, I was downstairs working on figuring out the terrain forms around or in downtown York. God, I could fill an entire hour with talking about my trials and tribulations with that. But one of the things that's incredibly valuable and incredibly helpful to me is the fact that I can just go pull up downtown York on Google Maps and move around in Street View and be like, oh yeah, look at that. George Street is this wide. There's a lane for parked cars, but it's kind of narrow. A couple of two travel lanes, and then another line of parked cars. All right. Well, I know those lines are 6 inches. Yeah, it looks about right. Okay, close enough. Ability to instantly check things. And literally, I'm doing that on my phone while I'm standing there in front of the layout, moving bits of styrene around to get everything positioned. Incredibly valuable. The realization of that and the ability to do that, I think, is one of the things that makes being able to model things with a high level of fidelity these days a lot easier than, previous generations of modelers have had it.
That's very true, because even if you can't physically travel to the location of your prototype, or even if you're freelancing the location of your freelance railroad, you can visit it with Google Street View. You can actually go look and see what the colors and textures are, which is kind of the next question, is approaching color and texture and scenery layering. Well, we both have.
Before we get into that, there were a couple of things in here that Chuck talked about, or had in his questions, that I written down a whole bunch of thoughts on. I wanted to kind of touch on some of those before we move on.
Sure.
That one of them is, what separates realistic modeling from simply detailed modeling? The first thing I wrote down, George Sellios versus Alan McClellan. On one hand, George Sellios's work, right, his Franklin and South Manchester, incredibly detailed.
Oh, yeah.
incredibly unrealistic. I feel like that might be a hot take, but I don't think that's that hot.
I think George would agree with you, because I know there's been articles recently of George actually undetailing parts of the layout.
Which I think is a shame, because, I think there's also this idea of there's realistic modeling and then there's representational modeling. In the same way that in any art form, because we're just going to, operate under the belief that this is an art form, because it is.
Mm-hmm.
In any art form, you have genres, right? In painting, you have people who are trying to make their painting look as photorealistic as possible. Then you have people who are impressionists.
Like Malcolm Furlow.
yeah, exactly. And then you have people who are abstract artists, right?
Yep.
All of those people are painters. All of those people are artists. They're still working in the same medium, but they just might be going at it with different aims, right? And I think a perfect example of that is Lee Weldon and I, right? Lee and I have been friends now we were talking about this the other day, like 20 years. Over the years, our modeling style has diverged quite a bit.
Yes,
right?
they have.
We're still just as good of friends as we were back in the day, maybe even better. And we still share enough knowledge and shared interest to, still enjoy the hobby together. But we approach the same thing very different. And both of them, I think, turn out, both approaches have tons of value. So, for example, his Cumberland Station T-Track module, readers of this or listeners of this have probably seen that before. And if not, Chuck can throw some video or some photos of it here. But it's a fantastically rendered model of the Cumberland Station.
Oh, yeah, that's a great module. And having been to Cumberland, he nailed it.
Yeah, he did, right? And he nailed the feel of Cumberland on that module.
Mm-hmm.
The way he and I would approach that exact same subject, very, very different. If I were building that, all of that town of Cumberland that's in the background on his, that have all those really just fantastic buildings, neat little scenes, all of that, because my model, all of that would just be parking lot. Because I would have taken the Google Street View or the Google Map, printed it out, stuck it down on the thing, and been like, yep, one station building, 300 parking spots. I don't know where I'm going to find 300 vehicles to park in there. Maybe we'll just call it a day that the trains aren't running. One, I don't think I would build the structure as nice as Lee has. But even if I had the same centerpiece, right, that if Lee gave me an identical version of that building to his, and we both did the module the same way, or with our own approaches, they would both look very different. I would almost hazard to guess that people who saw mine would be like, oh, that's neat. They wouldn't immediately go, oh, he nailed Cumberland the same way that Lee did. And that's because he takes a much more representational approach, even sacrificing some elements of like photographic realism the same way that I would.
Yeah, and the stuff Lee's doing now, I mean, he's doing he's kind of going for this retro nostalgic vibe, which is fun in and of itself. I actually really enjoy, because it reminds me, and I when I was a kid, I worked in HO and not N scale, because that's what my dad passed on to me. But sort of the same thing, just like click and track together and loops over loops and all the fun stuff. And he's having a blast. But, there are times where as sort of a prototype modeler, I miss his earlier work with the Western Maryland. And he had some really good stuff with that as well. And I think that Cumberland module kind of represents kind of how he did the whole Western Maryland, which was, again, not photorealistic down to every tree in the right place, which is something actually I've tried to do in parts of my RGS layout. But overall, you have no question in your mind, but you're looking at the Western Maryland. Right? And that's, to me, that's realism, right? Same thing with, just like with your Northern Central, there's some parts where it just looks, because I've been on that route. I've ridden the Northern Central, steam it yesterday. I've gone up and down that whole line, and it just looks the part, even though some parts on your layout are kind of sort of freelanced, but I would call that proto-lancing, if that's a word. I know.
No, that whole, so the photos and the sections that you've seen right now that are actually scenic, that aren't the giant Windsor Street Yard. those are all completely freelanced, completely, they're the most model railroady thing that I'm going to make as part of that layout. And it's because it's a temporary return loop.
Yeah, but I mean, I swear I've seen that scene in real life. That's the whole point.
Yeah. And I mean, that is what I go for, right? Like when I think about my modeling games, because I think there was a thing in here about this, like why, a lot of the answer is because I get such a sense of satisfaction when I show people a photo that I've taken of some of the stuff I've done. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is my layout. And they're like, wait, that's a model? The phrase, wait, that's a model? That's like my, dopamine like button right there.
Well, and I think part of why that is most people, if they've even ever seen a model railroad, they see people like me that model in the green season. And the idea that somebody is modeling basically the stick season back east, that doesn't get done very often. And I know I could probably launch you on another 2-hour conversation about dead season modeling, but I think there's a handful of people, Lance Minheim being one of them, that I would associate with dead season modeling and just the challenges associated therewith. But I think that adds an extra layer of realism because we don't always see, I modeled the Pensy in the summertime because it reminded me of visiting my grandparents in the summer, right? And so I modeled it when everything's green and warm and sunny and all that stuff. And in retrospect, it's easier to do, especially at N scale, on a portable layout than modeling all the dead trees that you've modeled. But, looking at your layout and thinking, well, that's pretty much how we see it for a substantial part of the year, especially, in the mid-Atlantic where it's not snow covered all winter long either, the way it is out in Colorado, where you could see, I remember we had that conversation about discovering that not all grass is brown in the dead of winter back east either.
Yeah.
And how you made some assumptions about color that your subsequent observations of the real world challenged. And I thought that was really cool to watch that evolve.
Yeah, I have a note about that later when we talk about, some of the real world applications of this. Yeah, I think that is part of it. And I guess the reason why I do that, or thinking about the reasons why I enjoy that so much, is because I feel like our hobby has a certain reputation that, if you think about the pop culture representations of it, you're thinking about Reverend Lovejoy in The Simpsons, right? Or the people on Big Bang Theory, or Gomez Addams, right? I mean, God, the Addams Family was 60 years ago, 70 years ago, and people still, when you talk about model trains, they immediately go to Gomez Addams. Part of my motivation, now that I think about it, is the fact that I'm trying to change the perception of our hobby by showing people something that looks a little bit more real, right? Looks a little bit more serious.
Well, so when people think model trains, they generally conflate it with toy trains. So you think about train racing around a Christmas village or under the Christmas tree, or Thomas the Tank Engine, God forbid, right? Or some of the other things that they see. And realistic scale model railroading is still something that most people outside the hobby aren't tracking. I mean, every now and then somebody, I had an uncle who used to do that, right? So for case in point, we're getting ready to host our annual Christmas open house, and we bring everybody in, and invariably everybody wants to go see the layout because it's not like something they are typically exposed to. Now, there's this whole uber realistic module military diorama modeling hobby, which is really, really awesome. And people will see that, hey, that's really cool. Or, they'll see a model plane or a scene with a tank in the mud or something like that. No, by the way, that would be something, I don't know how much time we're going to end up having here, but talking about using military modeler techniques and materials for model railroading, which is something I do.
Oh my God. I feel like that's an entire separate episode.
That is probably an entire separate podcast. You're right. But, seeing that you can do that with kinetic models, model trains move, right? Especially, I model exclusively the steam era in all of my applications, and they especially move, even more so than, say, a diesel, right? You've got valve gear, and you got, drive rods, and you got all this other stuff happening, and sound, right? Especially
most of my God, I bet that blows people's minds when they see it. When they see it in N-scale or even HON3, right? Because your locomotives are not that much bigger than an N-scale standard gauge locomotive. You first see that and you turn on the light. When you turn on the power on the layout, and all of a sudden everything comes to life. Every
steam dynamo whirs to life, and then you start hearing the compound air pumps pumping, and then you'll hear a pop valve go, and it's like, holy crap. Sound. I mean, to me, doing what I do in narrow gauge, sound is such a big part of it, because that's how train crews communicated. The engineer and the conductor would communicate, or especially if you had double headers. And in the narrow gauge, they often cut the second engine in ahead of the caboose to distribute weight on those big wooden trestles and so on. And sound's such a big part of the overall realism. I find myself, as I've been installing Tsunami 2s, kind of not as enthused with my original Tsunamis that are in some of my Blackstone engines. And just even with sound, I feel like, yes, there's an embarrassment of riches. And even then, I'm not quite to where I want to be. And even in HON3, they're a little bigger than N-scale engines. But then I find guys in my club who are running ON3, and I hear that sound. And it's like, oh, bigger speakers, right? More.
Let me tell you, it was dangerous. The first time I powered up the sound decoder, that O-scale H3 of mine, I understand the call of O-scale modeling very much.
Oh yeah.
Just like there are times when I've got that engine just sitting on a display track in the basement, connected to my DCC system, just so that I could just hear it, right? And it doesn't even it's pre-electricity, so it doesn't even have a dynamo. It's just sitting there. You hear the gentle roar of the fire, and every once in a while you hear the appropriate air pump sound kick on. This is taken to another level, and I think even in N, that brings a whole new level to the experience and to realism, right? That I think, talking about how sound is an important part of the whole thing, it's not just from a perspective of, just the operational aspect, but it is very much that too. Even in the diesel era, and even in the modern radio communication diesel era, it adds another element of experiential verisimilitude to the experience. And I think there's a real learning point in that too, when it comes to the inclusion of sound, that sound isn't great when you're just sitting there running something around on an oval, right?
Right.
Sound, when if I'm running a train around at a train show on an N-track layout, it's kind of fun having the sound, even though you could barely hear it in most situations. But it's not really that beneficial. But when I'm sitting there kicking cars around in Windsor Street Yard, and the locomotive is 18 inches from my face, you couple up to the cars, and you get ready to make your move to pull them out of the track, notch up the throttle, and you hear the throttle spool up, and then the engine starts moving, and when you've got the flange squeal sound on and you're hearing that, then you get the crossing and you got to hit the bell and blow the horn. For one, you're much more engaged with your model.
Mm-hmm.
And two, it's making you get more out of that same model, because I guarantee you, if there was a study that did a time and motion study on model railroaders, switching cars with a sound-equipped locomotive and a non-sound equipped locomotive, I bet you people do it twice as fast with the non-sound machine.
Oh, I bet you're right, because you're listening for those notches, and yeah, you're gonna be. I totally get that. And same thing on the steam side. I mean, I know I've seen steam switchers switch, and it's like I know I'm not going to have the 16 shafts a second speed kind of thing happening.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you're getting at is suggesting that sound is an important part of operation. I know it is for me.
Yeah, 100%.
When I get a stock extra up to the summit of Lizard Head heading to Rico, and I've got to cut out that helper because I'm not running with two locomotives down 4% grade, that's how they're talking to each other with whistles, and I got to do the brake checks up there and set retainers and all that stuff before I can proceed. And all of those sounds are happening through the locomotive sound systems. And I think that, again, that slows me down. That helps me really become more immersed in the experience, because that's really what I'm trying to do, right? I'm trying to experience something that has long been gone. that history has almost erased, not completely, but almost. And I want to get into that as if I were truly there. And sound is as much a part of of that experience as the visual. The only thing really that I'm missing, I think we've talked about this, is that acrid smell of coal smoke. And burning wooden brake shoes coming down the grade. Those are some. I wish I had a way to capture those in the train room. The closest I have come for adding the level of smell is I have those, little Bath and Body Works or whatever. I don't want to pitch for a specific brand, but those little plug-in
sponsor.
Yeah. And they make them that smell like pine trees. And so much of my HON3 RGS is basically the San Juan National Forest. And I must have, I'm guessing something to the tune of 1,500 conifers alone on that layout. And so when you're standing there, you smell a pine forest. What I can't get to is the smoke and I wish I could. I would pay real folding money for the opportunity to have one of those things that smells like coal smoke.
So, Dave, I've got some good news for you.
Yeah.
Terry and I were at a craft fair a couple of weeks ago, and there was a candle vendor.
Mm-hmm.
And he had some dude candles. And one of them was called Black Powder.
Oh.
And I made sure to grab you one, along with myself.
Sweet.
So I've got to find some more Pensy equipment at a train show to buy on your behalf. Because it's not worth shipping it's not worth paying $10 to ship the $4 candle to you.
Oh, I know the smell of black powder pretty well. Other hobby, I used to be a Civil War reenactor with the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteers, Company C.
Yeah,
I know what black powder smells like, but I also know what black powder tastes like. If you ever watched a soldier rip a cartridge with paper, swallowed at least. Oh, I'm not going to go down that road.
Yeah, it's I don't think it did a great job of smelling like black powder, but it's got a lot of those same compounds, and I think it's not going to quite coal smoke and creosote smell of Strasbourg.
Yeah. But
it's the closest thing I've found so far. Yeah. We'll have to try it out. We'll report back on a future episode of the podcast.
Yeah.
And if it's good, we'll put a link in the description so that everyone can go get this and totally mess up the guy's sales analytics. Where he said, why am I getting all these mail orders from all over the place for this specific candle? I have to put a referral code in there, get a cut or something. But
so I guess the only sense we're missing then is taste.
Well, I've got a glass of whiskey on my desk right now.
I've got the pop-out drink holders on my fascia for.
I know. I have availed myself of those.
Bourbon.
But I know, it's a funny thing. But railroading in the eras that we model was not a completely sober event, right?
Oh yeah, my father and I were talking about that when we went toward the RGS right away, looking up where the trestles used to be at Ophir. No sober man would do that. No sober man would be a brakeman on a train coming down 4%.
Yeah, I bet that if you
trestle at night in the snow, right?
Yeah, you need a good bit of liquid courage for that job. But yeah, even myself, I modeled pre-Ricky Gates Conrail.
Yeah.
So I think I mentioned on the previous podcast, but at some point when I actually start having op sessions, someone's going to draw the chance card and be like, okay, go take this joint out back, burn it down, and then let's run some trains, right? Because you were Ricky tonight. And, I think that kind of speaks to the idea of immersion and multimedia realism of this stuff, that there's a lot of fun to play with. Now, that also gets into one angle that I know a number of people have asked me to talk about with you, and that's the concept of the idea of operation, right?
Huh.
And I think you just talked about something really interesting in that vein, which was that stock extra. And even though you don't do operations with a big O, right? You don't do car cards and waybills. You're not using JMRI.
I tried. You'll see car card buckets that are full of old cars that haven't moved.
Yeah, and because that's not you, right? We've talked about that extensively between us. But for the audience, it's not Dave, right? He's kind of a roundy rounder. But what I've seen is that you do this thing where even though you're not, worried about, hey, these stock cars are billed to that person, and this, this car of ore is going to this consignee and things like that, the way that I am way too obsessed about in my own world. You're still doing those operations things. Even if you're just running trains, you're not just running trains. You're still doing that thing of, we're going to have helpers on this, but we're not going to run around the whole layout. And when we go to cut out the helpers, I'm going to do the right whistle sounds and stuff. That's still operating.
And to be honest, I think, I tried to get into operations when I was doing the Pensy on the door, and you become very, very quickly. And you've had this whole thing about, it was, I think in your previous podcast, or it might've been the Northern Central talk that you gave, where every Pensy modeler ends up modeling the Buffalo line because the middle division is just too tough. Mm-hmm. And I just got overwhelmed very quickly. Every time I sat down and tried to figure out, even if I modeled an 8-hour trick, first off, I would have to divide that by 2 because I had half as many tracks. I don't even know if it scales that way. Maybe it's scaled.
Fast talk, man. You need a slow talk.
Yeah, but just trying to figure that one out. And I just kind of got to where, what do I enjoy about trains? Well, I enjoy watching them, and I'm kind of a rail fan. But so if you were rail fanning the Rio Grande Southern in its last decade of operations, and you were waiting for a train to come down off the Lizard Head Pass, you would almost invariably see the helper come down light ahead. And then, assuming they hadn't derailed on the way down, eventually you'd see the train that it had helped. And then that would be it probably for a couple of days, other than the Galloping Goose. So that's a pretty easy thing to get your head around. And so when we talked about this, that maybe because most of the trains on the Rio Grande Southern in particular, but a lot of the Denver Rio Grande Western narrow gauge toward the end were operated just as extras. And so they were operated pretty much as locals. Switch lists actually are more than sufficient for doing what I want to do. I got to cut cars at Ridgeway. I got to get some of them down along the line, and the rest I got to turn over to the 2nd District at Rico for the train that's coming up from Dolores. And that's easy to do with a switch list, and that's all you got to do. And I can do that by myself. I don't need a crew of 16 guys to do it.
Yeah. And I think, there's really something to be said for that. And I think what you've kind of backed into there is the same thing that's this very big trend in the hobby at the moment, where people are building simpler layouts and having just as much fun. So when you think about, one of the people I was thinking about was James McNabb, the guy who's done the really awesome Iowa Interstate Hills line.
Oh, yeah.
He's been in MR a bunch. He's been in a bunch of the Kalmbach Fire Crown stuff. Really good guy. Fantastic modeler. He's modeled a section of layout or a section of railroad that's like a pretty sleepy branch line, but he has plenty of fun with it. And he's done a fantastic job of there's plenty of actual modeling stuff to build there. And no, he's not building, tons and tons of trestles, but he's building really fine scale models of typical stuff, right? He had to do a substation. He had to do, a couple of tilt-up warehouses. He had to do, just a regular street. And when he did his regular street, to scale. So it's, 18 inches wide in HL. He's got a very operationally entertaining layout for himself that he hasn't had to go spend, tens of thousands of dollars on locomotives to fill. The average sale price, I think the mass market freight car in all scales has continued to go up at a pace that does outpace inflation. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that we just get better models, right? Like more prototypical detail or more prototypical big things. So I'm not even talking about the fact that, they have the right cut levers, or they have cut levers or stuff like that. But I'm talking about things like, this 50-foot boxcar is actually 50 feet. This car is supposed to have 2 8-foot doors, and it actually has 2 8-foot doors instead of a 10 and a 6. But in addition to that, we are getting all those much finer details as well. I think this was one of the things that Alan McClellan noticed and realized and embraced when he was building the Allegheny Midland was, when you've got a big layout and you've got a train of 50 coal hoppers going by, no one's really stressing out that none of them have separate grab iron. And like that made a lot of sense back then because you could buy blue box coal hoppers in bulk. And the tough part was the time in upgrading them if you wanted them all to have individual grab irons. But now we live in a world where you can go to go online, buy a Rapido hopper car that shows up with all the brake piping involved. How do you get the most enjoyment out of that? Well, you have a slower paced, smaller layout, puts that stuff front and center. And I think that's the thing that you've done with yours, where you've got all of this just exquisite equipment. If you had a big giant op session with 15 people over and everyone trying to hit the fast clock, a lot of the impact of that will be lost.
Yeah, but like you said, on the flip side, when you're modeling sort of big time railroading like you're doing, grateful that a lot of those older cars like the Trainman line and some of the other cars that can be had at a lower price point are still available. But of course, that clock is going to run down at some point as well. But that you can build up a unit train of coal for that's 30, 40 cars and not have to worry about each one of them being a $70 masterpiece, right? Exactly.
I have a whole lot of $5 Atlas 90 tonners that make up my unit coal train.
That's what I was doing with the Pensy when I was dabbling in Conrail as well. I do want to circle back on something you mentioned, and you were talking about what sounded to me like sort of Tony Kester's take on modeling the mundane rather than modeling the exceptional. I think that goes also to this idea of what's realistic versus what's detailed. I think to me that's the overarching theme for realism. Now, it's a little hypocritical because I model a very, very unique and exceptional railroad, right? I mean, there's not a lot out there that was engineered the way the RGS was, 162 bridges and 162 miles. But even then, so much of it was just a single weedy track wandering through the high country wilderness. Try to capture some of that instead of going for just the exceptional scenes, I am more attracted to, like, if I go to a train show and I see a modular layout, the modules that are just meant to represent sort of run of the mill, everyday scenery that you would see out train chasing. Versus, the drive-in theater with the screen that's flashing, or I don't even want to get into
or a rendition of like the Devil's Canyon Bridge, right?
Yeah. I was going to say I don't want to get into things like alien abductions and
but even aside from that, I mean, the Devil's Canyon Bridge is a great example. One of the local N-Track clubs has had for years this gigantic, it goes all the way to the floor model of I think it was the Devil's Canyon Bridge. It might have just been another one of those very large arch bridges like that. Incredibly, technically incredible model. But yeah, I agree. I've never oh my God, I got to go watch my train go over that at one of those big N-Track meetups. And you've got the New River Gorge modules. Oh man, the spot where it's just like the track rolling along next to the river, where it's just a bunch of trees, some tracks, and some water. Oh, you still my heart.
But I think modular layouts are a little bit different when they're made to be taken to shows, because what a guy like you or me might be drawn toward may not be what the general public may be drawn toward. I think the general public definitely resonates with the big bridges and the movie theater drive-ins and the haunted house on the hill with the real ghost inside you can see. And that's the sort of thing that you see people, point and gawk at. But here's the thing. I wouldn't want people to walk away thinking that's model railroading. It's an aspect of model railroading, to be sure.
Yep.
But to me, so this is one of the things I enjoy taking my stuff to shows. Like I, as I know you take your modules to shows, I've taken the Colorado Midland, the N-scale Colorado Midland layout, and I know I've shared some pictures with Chuck, to some of the local shows here. And even though it's been gone 100 years, everybody here in Colorado Springs knows about the Colorado Midland because there's just enough of the bones left that, and it was a large part of, the town's history. And so people will come up to it. Now, it's not a hyper realistic layout in that it's two loops and the loops cross over each other. And I've got this big old retaining wall and it's model rarity, and it's meant to be model rarity to a point. But I've also kind of tried to make it such that it's not completely out of the realm of plausibility. This is like where I'm going to throw props over to Dave Meek, where it's fantasy, but not so far out of the realm of believability that you just it's right in that sweet spot.
Yeah.
And that's what I've been trying to do with the Midland, in that The structures are all based on real structures in Colorado. The bridges are all engineered like a railroad would engineer bridges, particularly the Colorado Midland. I used their engineering drawings to build my bridges, right? And some of the structures on the layout are actually from like Aspen Historical Society. I actually scratch built from plans they had online and so on. And yet, of course, I have the steep rock walls and the double trestles and all that stuff that are really model rarity. So I try to kind of split the difference, and it gets a lot of playtime. A lot of people come over and I get lots of compliments, swells my head. And I'm not real good with taking compliments, but people will say, hey, this is the best thing at the show. And I'll ask them why, because I'll look at other layouts and go, oh, this is, that other work is really, really, really great. Part of it is because I demonstrate that you can do a lot in a small area without completely overwhelming that same space. And that's, to me, realism. When you get back to that whole, I think we talked about it where, with layout design and you were saying the new trend, a little bit less is a little bit more. And I know we've talked about negative space, and that's something I can never get enough of. I never leave enough of. But the idea of just the track in the wilderness, nothing else except maybe some line poles or maybe a set of signals somewhere. But otherwise, not always, where the locomotive is in one town and the caboose is in the next town, and there's some signature scene in between.
I've done the same thing with my T-track, with some of my T-track models, right? And my T-track stuff, I basically have taken two separate paths with it. Some of it is very much representational, I'm intentionally trying to be a little less head up my own rear about it. I'm just trying to recreate some things from childhood in a fun way, right? That's one aspect of it, or one group of them. But the other one, my two Northern Central modules, it's the pair, where it's not completely negative space. There is a bridge on it, and there is a road on it, but there are no buildings on it. And it's just a very typical generic scene from the Northern Central that always gets a lot of comments at shows where it's, it's their neck, like it's in the same layout, the same T-track layout as the Star Wars module, as the Bikini Bottom module, as even as Randy Gustafson's. Yeah, Dave, that's kind of one of the things that I've done with my T-track modules as well, right? Like the Northern Central ones always get a whole lot of attention when I take them to shows. Maybe not from, the folks with kids in the stroller, but other modelers, or even people who are kind of curious about getting into the hobby. And especially in a public setting, I think that's incredibly valuable. And that's, more so than, we need to make sure that people can get affordable train sets, which I think, is an important thing. I think your modules, I do want to point out, I think your modules do demonstrate it's not the quantity of details, it's the right details. Yeah. I mean, it was funny. I was even thinking about that. I've gotten some road signs and things to put on them. Just, the road signs that honestly should be there in a real scene. When I started putting them in and thinking about it, I'm like, I don't know, this actually, in its totality, I feel like it works better without them. And no one's ever called me on the fact that I don't have a height sign on that bridge, right? No one's ever been like, oh, that's, whatever. But yeah, it looks nice, but you're missing the guardrail. That, the terrain looks like the tracks run through the scenery as opposed to the scenery being placed around the trains. Yeah. And my number one tip for realism, make your trees big. If you think your trees are too big, they're not big enough. Real life is huge and trees are tall. Speaking of, there's one thing I also realized I wanted to talk about. I recently read this book by CJ Riley. It's from, it was done by Kalmbach. I think Firecrown probably still puts it out there. It's done under the guise of Model Railroader. And it's called Realistic Layouts Using the Art of Illusion to Model Like a Pro. Never paid attention to this before. The other day, was over at Dave Betts' layout, dispatching. And, he models the Western Maryland. Dispatching, you're not constantly doing stuff. And I noticed he had a copy of this sitting at the desk. So I started thumbing through it. And I realized this is the book I wish I wrote on model railroading. Really? I never paid attention to it because the headline is use the art of illusion. And I'm like, whatever. Yeah, mirrors. Okay, great. I've read about that for my entire life. But he talks about all of the things that we've kind of talked about in this conversation and just ties it all up really well in a $20, relatively short book, where he talks about things like get the engineering right, model the mundane. I don't think he devoted a thing about making trees so tall, so that's my contribution. But it was one of those books where I'm like, yeah, nothing in here is world, is world shattering to me. And I'm like, but this, like, if someone wanted to say, hey, how do I build model trains like you do? I'd give them a copy of this book.
I'm gonna have to check it out.
Yeah. Again, you're going to be like, oh yeah, whatever. But keep it in your library and load it out to anyone who's like, how do I do this?
I will say, I think something, even though you and I are modeling two very different things, I think something where we both agree, and I think we probably are, doing some of the similar things is in sort of that scenic texture. Because I think we're talking about detail, right? And detail isn't just, barrels by the side of the road or street signs. I think detail is scenic detail. I think textures. And, I look at your dead season modeling and see all the dead leaves that you see in the wild during that season in the mid-Atlantic. And you just don't see that modeled very often. And it looks so right because it's just what we would see. And
you know what's funny about those dead leaves? They're still there in the summer. No one models them.
That's true. I mean, it takes several years for one of those leaves to rot away completely.
Oh yeah. And when they do, the next 3 years are on top.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Like one of my fundamental moments of like my fundamental epiphanies of dead season modeling was that, hey, you know what? Modeling the tree, everyone worries about how do you model the trees, but it's how do you model all of the stuff, like all of the vegetation that isn't trees that summer modelers just cheat with using, clump foliage that you can't get away with in the winter. There is no such thing as dead season clump foliage. Once I started thinking about how to tackle that, then a lot of the other things all fell in place.
Well, I can tell you, I've moved away from clump foliage. Now, I'm still using some of that for my Pensy T-Track modules because they're meant to be robust and take a beating, right?
Yeah.
But, like with the RGS, if you were to slice through, please don't, a section, like a piece of the layout, and you would see multiple layers, like to get to that finish that you see on the top scenery, starts with a layer of real dirt from the real location modeled, followed by some coloring that's some fine ground foam and some products that I get from Scenic Express, and then followed by layers of things like static grass and bushes and things like that, and low grass and so on. Because again, this goes back to, modeling the real world versus modeling what you've seen other people model. One of the things that when anybody asks me about how I got my layout to look the way it does, because I went out and I observed what the Colorado high country looks like the third week in September. And it is vastly more vegetated, greener, lush than I've ever seen other modelers model it. And so that requires a lot of texture too. And so there's a lot of layers that go into that. And, the idea that you can just zip texture something or just throw down a layer of ground foam and move on to the next scene, that's going to
what you're going to get is something that looks like you just threw down a layer of ground foam.
Yeah, it's going to limit your realism. I'm drawn to scenic texture because the real world, even in places that are drier, like where I live out here versus, when I used to live in Pennsylvania, how lush it is back there. I mean, it's just texture. You see so many different textures. It's not just colors, it's the textures.
Yeah. And that scene that you were talking about at the very beginning, that S-curve scene, when I first did that, I kind of just very quickly ground foamed it and moved on. I was incredibly unhappy with it. Like, it just didn't look right. It didn't look, I was really struggling. I'm like, what's wrong with this? And I think you pointed out, hey, you need more texture to it. Like, well, not just you and Dave Betts, two of the dangerous Daves in model railroad.
Daves think alike.
And you guys were like, it needs more texture. Just throw in some more deadfall, throw in some more static grass, throw in, something. And when I did that, it was like night and day. Like all of a sudden it just like.
Well, and that's just it. For me, I very rarely consider a scene finished after the first or second or even third pass. Even today, I'll go down and, scene I finished 6 years ago and a few more weeds here, or remove something that doesn't quite look right. No scene is ever finished. Don't ever treat a section of your layout like it's done forever.
Hits on one of the other things that I think Chuck really wanted us to talk about,
Oh, the old
was
rail.
the importance of community. Speaking about the Railwire, right, which is this forum that we've been members of I've been a member of for over 20 years now. It's a bunch of online friends who have actually somehow become real friends. But I know that personally, I have a feeling you probably do this too. When you're working on something, you're always thinking about, hey, how is the Railwire going to react to this?
Exactly. I'll be like, they're going to call me out on that. I better fix that.
Yeah.
That's the joke is better modeling through peer pressure. But I mean, honestly, if you want to up your game, you got to be willing to kind of go that route. If you really want to up your game, you have to be willing to open yourself up to some criticism. And I know that there's a lot of places where that kind of criticism, it's not mean-spirited, but it's constructive, but it is blunt, where that isn't welcome. It depends on what you want to get out, right? So there's places you can go on Facebook. There's places you can go. There's other forums out there. I'm not going to name some, but they've been around for a while, where if all you want are attaboys and accolades, post your crappiest picture taken with a motion blur and everything, and you're going to get, that's amazing. And if that's what you need, that's great. But
look, man, don't hate. Sometimes you just got to build up that self-esteem.
It's true. That's true. Yeah, there are times where I look to see, hey, how many upvotes did I get on the Railwire, right? But
yeah, exactly.
But fundamentally, I think if you really want to up your game and kind of move out of your comfort zone, and hopefully, if we're going to spend time and money, which model railroading is a lot of time and a lot of money, then we're going to want to move out of that comfort zone. We're going to want to keep upping the game a little bit, right? You need that kind of community where you're going to get that kind of feedback. And every now and then you're going to run into a jerk. There's the Railwires had their fair share. Every forum does. But I would say the vast majority of it's been super, super constructive. Like, so there's always somebody who knows something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I know that prototype and that's great, but more often they did this other thing, or have you looked into doing it this way as opposed to that? This might give you a more realistic result. That to me is really, really helpful. And I joked that, getting invited back when the Railwire was invite only, it was like joining the majors. And I was like, hey, I got called up to the majors, right? And how cool it was, and how immediately I had imposter syndrome, looking around like, oh, these guys think I'm cool enough to hang with them. They think my stuff is that good. And it wasn't at the time. I look back at the work that I was doing back when I think I joined the Railwire in 2007. I'm like, oh my God, really? They liked that?
Well,
they thought I was worthy of hanging with those guys?
I saw the spark.
And that's really what it is. Because between you and Lee Weldon, I think you saw the potential. Not to be mean, but you saw the potential there, which I appreciate. Mm-hmm. Really, that's what it's been. It's been about, a bunch of like-minded modelers, almost all of whom are focused on this idea of realism.
Yep.
And whether it's, building a better piece of rolling stock, better weathering, better scenery, better layout design, better operations.
Yep.
What you're going to find there is this community that's focused on making it more realistic. And there's where we are definitely in one camp with sort of that toy train kind of on the other side of the camp, on the far side of the camp.
Yeah.
But there are groups out there too. You mentioned community, like Facebook is another place where people have their opinions about Facebook, and I recognize, I totally respect people who don't want to be on it, but there are pockets of greatness out there too. And
yep.
Some of the narrow gauge modeling that's done out there, and the affiliation groups associated with railroads like the East Broad Top, the Rio Grande Southern, the Denver and Rio Grande Western, the Pennsy, and so on, where you're going to find so much knowledge and so much good modeling out there that if you're not about yourself of social media, you are sort of making a sacrifice to the ignorance gods that you're going to miss out on all of this.
Yeah, it's why I highly recommend to everyone, don't delete your Facebook account. I'm fortunate enough that a lot of my model railroad friends and I are pretty much aligned on life philosophies. But there are some folks who I'm friends with through my mutual interest who we just don't talk about that aspect. Anyway, I think we've covered most of the several areas that Chuck wanted us to do, and wanting to leave something for the future, because I feel like this was a lot of fun and we're gonna have to do it again.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that we touched on that we could have turned into entire podcasts. Yeah.
So for the audience out there, if there are things you heard Dave and I talk about where you're like, hey, talk more about that, or hey, you guys are stupid, you missed this entire thing, throw it in the comments, right? Yep. First off, Chuck will love the engagement. And second, for some reason, everyone says that I need to hear all the ways that I'm dumb.
And if you want to see more of the modeling that we do, you can visit us at therailwire.com, or I know we both have our own respective YouTube channels. Both of my model railroads have their own independent Facebook pages. So the HO13 RGS First District and the Colorado Midland and N Scale.
I've got my main squeeze website, Conrail 1285.
It's another awesome Train Talk Media podcast, this time around with Dave Vollmer and Ed Kapuscinski. What a great episode, Realism and Model Railroading. Now in December, we've got some great podcasts coming up. Matt Forkham drops by and talks about his conversion to 50s railroading on the MF lines, and then it's a real treat in mid to late December. Volker Meisner from Germany, the awesome UP Santa Fe modeler who's done Tehachapi and parts of Tennessee Pass in HO, just realistically incredible. All on Train Talk Media.